Good morning, everyone. My name's Todd Barker. I'm a senior partner at the Meridian Institute, which is a nonprofit organization based in the U.S., and we specialize in collaborative problem solving and conflict resolution. I've worked on food and ag policy issues domestically and internationally for about the last 15 years. It's an honor to be here. One of the projects that I work on extensively right now is called AGREE, Transforming Food and Ag Policy. It's an effort in the United States that's jointly funded by 9 U.S. foundations to look at the challenges facing the global food and agriculture system and identifying consensus-based strategies for ways that U.S. investments and policies should shift over the coming years to better address those challenges. And I've been asked to moderate this panel. So just a few brief words before we get started, and then we'll just dive right in. One, as you heard at the beginning, this session is on the record, so if you would like your comments not to be on the record, you should say so up front, or if you have regrets afterwards, you can let us know and we'll work with you on that. But we would like you to speak as freely and frankly as possible. This is a double session, as Ken alluded to, so we'll have a coffee break and come back in here and continue with our panelists. At 2 o'clock after lunch, there will be report outs from the breakout sessions, and I'll be helping with that, but if someone would be willing to serve with me as a rapporteur, I would greatly appreciate it. Any volunteers? Somebody? Come on now. Nobody? All right, thank you. Okay, so, and if you can be listening through the session for some key themes, I'll be doing the same thing, and then we can compare notes over lunch and work on a report out. Jane, Malin Katie from the McKnight Foundation will be helping to moderate that session, so thanks for your assistance. I think in terms of, you have bios that were distributed in advance for all the panelists, so I'm just going to ask them to very briefly introduce themselves. More extensive bios are available for each of them. And we're going to start off with Darko, who has 10 minutes. I'm going to try as hard as I can to keep the panelists on schedule so that we have some time for conversation. So I think with that, unless there's any questions or anything from our organizers, we'll just dive right in. Okay? Darko. Sure. And you're going to need to use the mic so we can pick it up on the... Would you like some assistance?
About how this should operate, because should it...
You want me just to give me
yeah, okay, good.
Signal?
Right.
Or do you want to advance it yourself?
No, okay. It's fine. So if you can, if I give you a signal, you'll tell me. Yeah, good, great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Darko Znaur. I'm very honored to be here with this excellent group of people. And I'm very honored to have this opportunity to share some thoughts on externalities of nitrogen fertilizers. I've been studying this subject already for quite some years. It was also part of my PhD work that I did with Professor Jules Pretty at the University of Essex. And later on, based on that work, I also did some work for the FAO and Heinrich Böll Stiftung. It's a German foundation, and we try to assess externalities of agriculture systems in a couple of countries, being Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia. And based on that, I learned that actually nitrogen fertilizers are one of the most important stuff when it comes to agriculture externalities. So I will briefly try to cover 3 points. The first one being why nitrogen fertilizers. Secondly, I will try to present you an assessment framework, how to assess its externalities. And last but not the least, I will reflect on potential policy implications. So that will be briefly my outline of my presentation. Now, let's start with a key question. Why nitrogen fertilizers? Why they are that important in agriculture? So like with many things, there are 2 sides. I'll first start with benefits. Well, they do boost yields, and they're quite cheap and easy to transport, store, and apply. Besides, or unlike pesticides, they are non-toxic and non-smelling. So it's really a great advantage. And when it comes also to environmental problems, also the proponents of nitrogen fertilizers, they argue that application of nitrogen fertilizers enhance carbon storage in biomass. Next one, please. Now, what about the downside of nitrogen fertilizers? Could we go back to the previous one, please? Yeah. Well, when we talk about downside, we should distinguish between the manufacturing and also the application. So when we talk about manufacturing, we have to realize that synthesis of nitrogen fertilizers is really an energy-intensive process based on fossil fuels. Mostly gas, natural gas is used as a feedstock. And it's a very polluting process. We'll talk more in a minute about those emissions. And last but not least, we have to realize that when it comes to nitrogen fertilizers, in many countries, the production is subsidized in one way or another. There are all kinds of hidden subsidies related either to its production, transport, or application itself. Then there's a downside related to the application. Of course, the first ones are related to environmental problems. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then there is also a very interesting phenomena being declining yield response, meaning that over the time, the crop or the yields are declined in the relation to the unit of fertilizers you apply. And also, application of nitrogen fertilizers can cause all sorts of secondary negative effects related to enhancement of certain pests, weeds, also if you have too much tissue, too much nitrogen in a plant tissue, then it can easily freeze, etc., etc. And then last but not least, farmers tend to become quite dependent on nitrogen fertilizers. And then we have to realize that in spite of all those awareness-raising programs, environmental problems, agri-environment programs, etc., there is still an increase in nitrogen fertilizer consumption in the world. This is at the world level nearly 1/3 in the last 12 years. And even in developed countries, you see a slight increase, and not to mention developing countries with a very clear trend. Now, let me present a potential methodological framework how we can assess nitrogen fertilizer externalities. Well, first, we can assess damage to air, climate, water, soil, and biodiversity. So environmental costs. And we can try to monetize it and put a kind of money value on it. And I say, well, we can use a sort of virtual currency called futuro. So not euro, but futuro. Those are the costs to be paid in future by someone. Then also, so besides the environmental costs, there is a side of the subsidies. Technically speaking, subsidies are not externalities, but a deliberate policy choice. But anyhow, those have to be taken into account as well when we talk about the true cost of, or external cost of nitrogen fertilizers. Now, the first step is to quantify emissions of the relevant pollutants. So those are the greenhouse gases. This is when we talk about production itself, so manufacturing. These are greenhouse gases, acidifying gases, and particulate matter. So these are all being emitted by nitrogen fertilizer manufacturing. And you can find also data on those emissions in different national reports for the relevant conventions on climate change, on air pollution, Gothenburg Protocol, etc. Now, what about the application, the farming itself? So there are all kind of emissions being, well, raising from soil, then from leaching, and also sure, leaching and runoff. Then there's a re-emission of some of these things, and then also atmospheric deposition or contribution of nitrogen fertilizers to atmospheric deposition. And again, you can find some of these, you can either assess it or you can try to dig through those reports that I mentioned again, or nitrogen balances for different countries, and you can find those figures. So the first step being quantification can relatively easily be done. Now, once we have identified the quantity of pollution, we should put a price to it. Now, there's a whole spectrum of environmental accounting approaches that could be applied to this. In my methodology, I propose that we do not reinvent the wheel, but instead that we use the emission values or prices that have already been developed and accepted by, well, in this case, European Environment Agency or by the European Commission. I know it's a bit Eurocentric approach, but we have to start from somewhere. So here is a reference to two major reports pointing out at the monetary value of different pollutants. So I'm not going to go into details, but if we apply these, for instance, these monetary values on the quantity of emission arising from the UK agriculture, then you will see that the UK agriculture produces roughly about 10 billion euro in terms of gross value added. But that the damage caused by greenhouse gases, by ammonia and nitrogen that is leached into water is representing roughly 36% of this gross value added. Now, once knowing that, one can ask, what are the potential policy applications? So it's a very complicated matter, and different economists have different, and different policymakers, they have different viewpoint how it should be organized. But basically, we can apply a two-track policy. Either employ economic instruments or awareness-raising instruments. Economic instruments, well, are those that can be either deterring or stimulating. And now, you can argue whether it is better to stimulate people by providing them, for instance, subsidies for a conversion to nitrogen-friendly farming, or tax them. I assume that taxing nitrogen fertilizers would be more effective on the short term, but we can discuss about that later. Well, finally, my last slide, I would like to conclude with the following. Nitrogen fertilizers are, from my point of view, a cornerstone of what I call doping agriculture. Because what we deal nowadays is a doping agriculture. It's agriculture that is not, so to speak, natural. It is based, nitrogen fertilizers are based on fossil fuels, meaning that once we run out of those, we have no nitrogen fertilizers. So it is lovely while it lasts. They produce huge externalities that are not accounted in. And we should look into those externalities. And of course, well, I think that a two-track policy would be the right approach, with green taxes being an effective method to reduce nitrogen fertilizers on the short term. Thank you very much for attention.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, and also to have, I think, a fuller, richer conversation, we'll just keep going with the presentation. So if you have questions for Darko, just make a note and we'll come back and have a plenary discussion. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so up next, peers. And peers, there wasn't a bio for peers in the materials you received, so I'm going to ask him, while I'm trying to find his presentation, for just a short bio from yourself. Thanks.
No worries. Thank you for that. Apologies, there isn't the bio. I only was invited to this sort of 48 hours or so ago, so it's great to be here. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave at the coffee break, but that's just the way it goes, I'm afraid. My name's Piers Clark. I'm the Commercial Director for Thames Water. I'm a scientist by my first degree. I did an environmental sciences degree 20 or so years ago. I then did a PhD in civil engineering, which I think gives me the ability to talk to engineers and scientists without needing to actually understand what it is that they tell me back again. I'm going to talk about phosphates. If we can just have the first slide, which is about Thames Water. I appreciate many of you aren't from the UK. Thames Water is the largest water utility in the UK. We serve the 14 million or so people that live in London and the surrounding regions. So here you can see London, and this is the blob inside the UK that we cover. Like I say, I'm the commercial director for it. That's all we need to say about Thames, because I'm going to talk about phosphorus. At the risk of telling you how to suck eggs, phosphorus is a vital nutrient. It's required for every living thing on the planet. We use it in our bones, in our DNA, in our teeth. If there wasn't phosphorus, we'd all be dead. We need about 1 milligram per day to keep us going. The less well-known fact about phosphorus is it's running out. It is a non-renewable, non-replaceable. There is no substitute for it, and at some point we will run out of it. Now, that sounds quite dramatic, and there's lots of scaremongers out there. Some people are predicting that we'll be at peak phosphorus in about 30 years. That's in our lifetime. Other people are being a bit more pragmatic and saying, no, we've got 100 years to go. Well, you know what? That's still my great-grandchildren's lifetime, so I'm kind of worried about that. Even the people who are most sort of restful about the phosphorus issue say, well, there's maybe 250 years. It's still not enough. I mean, it's not rocket science, is it? We're going to run out. And as we dig out more and more of the rock phosphorus from the ground, it gets more and more difficult to get hold of. It becomes more and more expensive to get hold of, and it is more and more contaminated. So it's just nonsense to keep trying to say, no, it's okay, we'll keep mining it. And we mine it from China, from North Africa, and from the United States. Europe ran out of its indigenous phosphorus reserves a good few years ago. So we have to import it rather. In the UK, no, keep staying on that one. It's all right, I've covered that slide, we'll stay on this one now. In the UK, we import about 140,000 tons of phosphorus every year. We export in our food about 25,000 tons. So we've got about 115,000 tons that we require in the UK, just to give you a scale sense of the figures. And here we go, we have the phosphate rock. We mine it, we put it into fertilizers, it comes into food, people defecate it out, and it eventually makes it back into the environment. Some of it gets lost in landfill sites, some of it gets lost in incinerator ash, some of it ultimately makes it down into the seas where it gets lost permanently into the sediments at the bottoms of the ocean. This is the loop we have to resolve. So the bit that's interesting, we can go to the next slide. The bit that's interesting is how much comes inside the wastewater treatment works, because actually that's where a lot of the phosphorus delivers. And of course it gives us a point source. It gives us somewhere where we can actually try and recover some of this phosphorus back. About 60% of the phosphorus that comes into the UK makes it back to the sewage works, and it gives us an ability to grab hold of it. Of course, actually, from a sewage works operator's perspective, we didn't think about phosphorus as anything other than a problem until recent years. Phosphorus in the sewage works actually then creates these sort of struvite deposits inside our pipes. It's a bit like fat globules collecting in your veins when you're eating the wrong diet. And from our side, we hate this. This just means we've got to put more energy into the pumping to get our sludges through these various pipes. Actually, this is a really valuable resource that we need to recover. So if we can go to the next slide. There is, with this disastrous situation facing us, there is an opportunity which we need to grab. And we have just built in Slough. We've built in Slough Europe's first phosphorus recovery facility that uses a process from Canada called the Ostara Crystal Green process. And it actually recovers the phosphorus through a reactor over here, and you get it as a very pure, high-grade, slow-release fertilizer. From the sewage works perspective, you know what? The business case around doing this was because it saves us £200,000 a year in terms of our operating costs. We actually aren't interested in selling the phosphorus. We say, well, we're a water company. Our job is to supply water and treat people's wastewater. We don't understand or want to understand the risks associated with stepping into the phosphorus supply market. So actually, we've agreed a sort of fairly low risk price to Crystal Green and to Ostara, and they take the fertilizer off our hands and they will supply it into the market. The prices of phosphorus have actually gone up 5-fold in the last 10 years. And you know what? They're only going to go in one way. But as far as Thames Water is concerned, right now for this first facility, which will recover 150 tonnes a year of phosphorus in this fertilizer form, so that's about 1/1000th of the amount that comes into the UK. So, you know, we've got to put this into perspective. But it's the first facility, and it's been running for about 6 weeks or so now and is working incredibly well. I think that's probably it. All right, so here you can see, just summarising what I've just said, we're taking what is a problem for us, recovering it through to create the fertiliser. It's an incredibly simple process. We're basically doing a bit of pH adjustment and a tiny bit of chemical addition, and the granules drop out automatically, and we can screen them off so that you can provide to the fertiliser market, you know, big granules or small granules or whatever is appropriate for the crop. I think that's probably it. And there you go, coming back to the first graph. That's essentially the story. My details are, you not only don't have my biog, you also don't have my contact details, and I'm disappearing. So should anyone want to know more about this, we're very keen to tell the world about this. Hey, come and have a visit to Slough. It's marvellous. It's right near the motorway. It's very easy to get to. My details are piers.clark@thameswater.co.uk.
And Piers, are you leaving right now?
No, I'm going to stay. Yeah.
Okay, great. So you have time for some questions at the end. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Scott, I think you're up next. And then get your slides up here.
So my name is Scott Swinton. I'm a professor at,
Yeah, microphone. Thank you.
right. So I'm is this on? Yeah. I'm based at Michigan State University. I'm an economist, an agricultural and environmental economist, and I work closely with a group of ecological scientists, among other things through the long-term ecological research site funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation that is the one site that looks at ecology of agricultural systems. So I want to kind of bring across about 3 key ideas in this talk. My main focus is on how we think about the values of agricultural externalities, and how we understand that from the producer side as well as from the consumer side. So if we look at the producer side, ecosystem services come from agriculture. There's a whole set of services that support agriculture, that enable agriculture to be productive. That includes the kind of nutrient cycling that we've heard about. It includes natural regulation of agricultural pests and so forth. So we can think about agriculture as a managed ecosystem where the farmer is the one doing the managing, and out of this ecosystem come a whole suite of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services that have markets, such as for food, fiber, and biofuels. And of course, many ecosystem services that don't have markets, some of which are beneficial, such as carbon sequestration by agricultural plants, others of which we can think of as disservices. And here we are in a session about pollution, and pollution can come out of agriculture, and that's why we're interested in true cost accounting. My key point here, though, is that the services come out in bundles. So if farmers change one management practice, that changes the mixture of services that come out. And the fact that these come out jointly is important for policy design. So a little bit of economics 101, but this too was important for thinking about values. So Darko listed some environmental economics methods, but I want you to think with me a little bit about how we get values from ecosystem service outcomes of agricultural systems. What do we mean by demand? Well, demand is what people who care about those environmental services are willing to pay for it. And on the supply side, supply is what it costs producers to produce those services. And in the parlance of environmental economics, we will sometimes talk about willingness to accept, what a producer would be willing to accept as a payment in order to produce something. So prices in markets are determined by the intersection of supply and demand. When we think about things that don't have markets, like avoidance of phosphate runoff, for example, avoidance of exposure to the consequences of excess phosphorus in the environment, it's useful to think about it in terms of what it would cost the producer to abate phosphorus production emissions and what consumers or citizens are willing to pay for that. So what drives producer behavior? Well, part of what drives it is direct costs of production. Those are the ones that we think about. What does, but a little bit more subtle is this idea of opportunity cost. So if farmers do something like plant a filter strip rather than planting an agricultural crop that would earn them income, there's a hidden cost to the farmer of not getting the revenue that they would have gotten from that place. Likewise, there are hidden costs of growing crops in rotation that may be less profitable than certain of the kind of primary crops. Obviously, another driver of behavior is environmental knowledge and information. And one thing I didn't think to add on this list, but I want to emphasize particularly right now, is that location matters a lot. Location, obviously we think of agriculture taking place where soils are fertile and there are good, good rains, but we can also think about this in terms of environmental vulnerability. There are some locations which are more likely, more environmentally vulnerable. And that becomes important for the, abating costs of pollution. From the standpoint of residents and consumers, people are willing to pay more if they have more money, and also based on their preferences and information. Now, one kind of, so as I've gotten involved in research on this, something that's become quite apparent is that when people think about agriculture on the supply side, scientists in particular, they focus on environmental outcomes from particular kinds of practices. And scientists will talk about phosphorus runoff, nitrous oxide volatilization, CO2, carbon sequestration. These are kind of abstract processes, and when you talk with citizens about how they feel about them, they don't really have clear feelings. What they care about are things like, if I go to the lake, can I go swimming, or will it be all green? How's the fishing in the lake? How is the weather changing? These are things that everyone experiences, and they are linked to ecosystem services that come from agriculture, but they're linked through these ecological processes. So there's an important disconnect here between the way that citizens experience the environment and the kinds of changes in practices that farmers need to undertake in order to cause those environmental outcomes to change. So we did a couple of large contingent valuation surveys, and I won't describe the methods here right now, but what we wanted to do was to understand among corn and soybean farmers, these are the most widely grown crops in the Midwestern United States and among the most widely grown crops in the world. We wanted to understand what it would cost farmers to change, and we gave them several alternative systems. And we paired this with a survey of ordinary citizens, randomly selected, to elicit their willingness to pay through taxes for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and reductions in the numbers of eutrophic lakes, which are things that can be achieved through changes in agricultural practices. So the idea here was to kind of connect willingness to pay by ordinary citizens with costs on the farmer side. And what comes out of this is that, in fact, there's a large area where it would be possible to pay through residents' willingness to pay for the costs of farmers moving to systems that involve cover crops, that involve integration of small grains, that involve reduced fertilizer use, all of which would generate these desired outcomes of fewer eutrophic lakes and less greenhouse gases. So a couple of takeaway messages from this. One is that farmers, I think farmers widely, but certainly farmers that we surveyed in Michigan, are willing to change practices if given the incentives to do so. Second, there is a willingness among citizens to pay for many, pay through some mechanism or other. In our survey, it was an income tax change, but there's a willingness to pay through some mechanism for improvements in the kinds of outcomes that could be achieved by farmers. And in this case, the kind of equilibrium payment there, where supply equals demand, was something like $45 an acre, which would be the equivalent of about a 10% increase in the prices of corn and soybeans. And that could shift a significant acreage of land into these more complex cropping systems that would have better environmental outcomes for climate and water. But I do want to emphasize in closing a couple of points. One is that just as the price of rice does not stay constant over time or over one place, likewise the costs of clean water, the cost of producing, the cost of greenhouse gas abatement are not constant. And it's important to bear this in mind. A second point, and those costs are driven by, I mentioned opportunity cost to farmers. As maize prices go higher, it becomes the opportunity cost of not growing maize or growing it in a way that would have lower yields becomes greater to farmers. One point that I didn't put on this list, but I think is quite relevant for our discussions today, is location. This idea of relative vulnerability of different locations. So as we think about designing policies that bring in true costs, that's likely to involve a shift in where things get produced as well as how things get produced. And I look forward to talking with you more about that.
All right, thank you very much. All right, Richard, you're up next. If you want to get this teed up, if you just want to do a brief intro while I'm pulling this up for you.
Sure. So can everybody hear me? It's my pleasure to be here today. I'm Richard Madison. I'm the CEO of TrueCost. We basically analyze externalities of a whole range of different activities, including food production, but across various different parts of the value chain as well, for businesses, but also for governments. And we've done quite a lot of work with investors, with major pension funds. So what I thought I'd do is zoom up to 30,000 feet to put the food system within a macroeconomic context, because I think that's quite important to understand, and then maybe drill back down again into some specific examples based on a study that we launched earlier this year with an organization called TEEB, which is the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. So, yeah, that's okay to move on, yeah. So really, in terms of risks that we face globally, we face some risks due to various different megatrends. We're going to have 3 billion more middle-class consumers between now and 2030. And over the same time frame, just as one little issue to expose with relative to that, we're going to face a water shortfall globally of 40%. So in order to satisfy that demand, which is a very exciting prospect to most CEOs, increased demand growth, we have some fundamental problems with how we supply. And the business as usual model will definitely need to change. But this is not a problem over the next 20 years alone. This is actually a problem we have been suffering. It's just we haven't actually recognized it yet fully. So over the last decade, we've seen a 100% increase in commodity prices relative to the last century. In the last century, we saw, on average, in real terms, a 1% decline in commodity prices. And over the last decade, we've seen a 100% increase. That's why there's an increasing focus from most business leaders on costs and input costs in particular. Also, over the last decade, we've seen an increase in the price the volatility of those commodities by 3 times, and volatility is very difficult to manage from a business perspective. So, and that is recognized at places like Davos. So if you, every year Davos at the World Economic Forum, they gather together the CEOs and major leaders of countries and various other people. And they launch a study every year called the Global Risks Report. And what I'd like to do is examine the top right-hand quadrant there, where the circle is. And I know you can't read that now, but this is an expanded version of that. On this axis here, the y-axis, you can see that the likelihood of this to occur, and the x-axis is the probability. So really what you're seeing is the highest probability and greatest risk, greatest likelihood. And these are the biggest problems, essentially. So, and in fact, these problems are all connected. So, rising greenhouse gas emissions would result in failure of climate change adaptation to some extent. Water supply crisis as well will impact in terms of extreme volatility in energy and agricultural prices, and also food crisis, which can lead to various of these governance failures as well. So pretty much all of the risks that the leaders of our global economies and the leaders of our global businesses perceive are linked to issues to do with environmental issues, to do with water availability, actually to do with food production. On the next slide, you can see that some people would say this is an extremely serious issue. So what if I said that the Arab Spring was actually caused by a drought? So most people would say you're absolutely insane. That's a ridiculous statement to make. But as an input, as one of the triggers, if I just explain the story, in 2010, East China had a serious drought that affected its wheat crop production. Now, China is a swing economy in terms of wheat, so if it has to start importing wheat, and net it doesn't normally have to import wheat, but if it has to start importing wheat, it creates a major increase in the price of wheat globally. So that's actually what happened. The price of wheat went up because China had to start importing at scale. However, Russia also had a drought at the same time, and at the time Putin stopped exports of the wheat globally. So the price of wheat went up by 150%. Now, why does that matter? Well, because actually, not just because we need wheat, but actually 6.5 kilograms of wheat go in on average as a food stock to beef, to every kilogram of beef. So the price of food overall went up. In fact, it doubled at the time. Now, in the Arab nations, they both import a lot of wheat for bread production, different types of bread. They're, in fact, of the top 10 importing nations of wheat, those Arab states are 9. 9 of those Arab states are the top 10. But also, in terms of food, in this country and in other developed economies, you might be spending between 5 and 10% of your income on food. But in those Arab nations at the time, that number was more like 40 to 50%. And so when you double the price of food because of 2 droughts in other places in the world, you suddenly see an issue because you see families unable to feed themselves because they're not earning enough money. So all these things connect, because then what happens is you have fragile states, you have issues to do with civil unrest spread by social media, which actually then creates an issue with the price of oil and oil production in general. And so all of these things are correlated, which is the reason why, for example, the Central Intelligence Agency and other intelligence agencies would say that climate change, and in particular water issues, are now the #1 risk globally. So on the next slide, this is why water is the #1 risk. Because actually, if you examine all the water prices, the market prices for water globally, there's actually a negative correlation between the price of water and how scarce it is, the water availability, which means that markets are actually failing to recognize a major externality with respect to water. And actually, if you have a look at crop production, which I'll come on to later, you see these kind of anomalies bear out as well. You can see certain types of production occurring in certain places at scale where they really shouldn't be occurring. So on the next slide, this is actually, as I illustrated, this was coming through in terms of commodity prices and volatility. Well, this graph shows that. So net over the last century, other than major events like world wars, you can see that commodity prices were persistently lower than they are today. And in fact, if you examine the volatility, you can see in the last decade that volatility has increased significantly. So on the next slide, what that means is actually that we face significant risks with respect to natural capital. We've already borne some of these risks. They've been reflected to some extent in markets, but they're unpredictable and highly volatile. And actually, what various different bodies, including the United Nations Environment Programme, wanted to do was to examine the scale and location of these risks globally. What are the externalities that we're facing? And in particular, what are the externalities created by businesses? And where are they located? And what kind of business activities are causing these major externalities? So we did this study to really put a price on natural capital across the world. It was quite an ambitious study. There does need to be a lot more work done, but the initial findings look like this. Essentially, what we did was we examined things like air pollution. So Darko presented a slide on air pollution created by nitrogen fertilizer production. And as you can see here, they have multiple effects. You can quantify the cost of each of the effects of air pollution. So in China, this looks close to 10% of GDP for China, which is the reason why the Chinese government is seriously considering polluter pays regulation for steel mills and energy production in China. So it has an impact on health. It also has an impact on crops. So between 7 and 15% reduction in crop yield, on average, in regions in China where air pollution is a major issue. So what we did was we put a price on the business activity that's creating an externality and where it's located. And if you go, yes, so overall, if you add up those externalities globally, you can see they amount to $7.3 trillion per annum. And if you look at the top 100 externalities, that's 4.7 trillion per annum. So that's the top 100 business activities that create environmental externalities in a particular location. And just to put some context, because these are really just big numbers, that is equivalent to both the GDP of China and also to the combined losses of OECD pension funds in 2008 as a consequence of the global financial crisis. So we're talking about an issue essentially the same size over time as the global financial crisis. So on the next slide, which is my last slide, you can see here what those top 5 externalities are. And 3 of them are related to food production. 2 of them are related to energy production. But just to emphasize one thing here. So what this shows really is that cattle ranching in South America creates an externality the size of $354 billion per annum. That's in terms of loss of ecosystems and other issues related to the production of cattle. In terms of the revenue achieved by cattle production in South America, that is actually 19 times revenue. So if I put that in shorthand, if you want to buy a beef burger from South America, you should actually be paying 19 times the price you're currently paying for that beef burger. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 35 minutes. Patrick said we were going to take an extra 10. We got started 10 minutes late, so we're going to take an extra 10 minutes. So we're going to take a coffee break a little after 11. So we have about a half an hour for discussion among yourselves and questions for the panelists. So I'd like to open it up, see if you have questions for specific panelists. If so, you can direct the question to them. I'd also be very interested to hear your reflections on, as you listen to the 4 presentations, if you heard themes that cut across them or connections among them, and we'll open it up for there. So questions, anybody? Yeah. And I think we're going to need to use the microphone so we can use the captured on the video.
Thank you.
It's on.
This is a clarification question for peers on phosphates. You put the emphasis on the capturing of phosphorus after it goes through the cycle. The question is, what are the possible efficiencies at the outset, which is before application or during application?
You mean for when we recover it?
Yeah.
Okay,
in other words,
yeah, it's a good question. So If you think about all the phosphorus that arrives at the sewage works, about 60% of it is actually already recycled to agriculture, because we generally recycle biosolids to agriculture. So we take the sewage sludge and we take it through an anaerobic digester, and it eventually gets spread as a fertilizer out in the fields. When it's spread like that, it's not controlled around the phosphorus, so it's a earthy, sludgy material that's applied usually, dependent upon, in the UK, 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and the phosphorus just goes with it, and it's a quick release phosphorus. When we do the Ostara process, we're capturing some of the stuff which would otherwise have been lost through the cycle, and in that we capture pretty much everything that's left in the phosphorus. So we're mopping up all of the stuff that wouldn't have normally gone through. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, actually, my question was more about the amount of fertilizer used and going into the system, whether you
By
can...
producers.
Yes.
Ah, okay.
Maybe I can try to provide an answer, Alexander Müller, and I would like to address in one of the next sessions also the phosphorus question. So there are very rough estimates that on the world around 36 megatons of phosphorus are currently being mined. 36 megatons. 24 megatons are used for producing fertilizers, and all people on the earth are eating only 3 megatons. So from 36 by mining to 24 being used in fertilizers to 3 only being used in food. So this is a very, very inefficient system. So if you look at the whole system, including your very interesting presentation, you see losses everywhere, but nobody cares because we have phosphorus for the next 100 years, so we don't need to care.
But are we getting at answering your question, Guillermo? I mean, was it about nitrogen use efficiency by producers?
Phosphorus.
Phosphorus.
Yes, I mean, its efficiencies are all along the cycle, but I mean, also, the more specific question is about the use of phosphates as fertilizers by producers, whether we're using too much. Mm-hmm. Whether we can think of technologies that would help us reduce the amount of phosphorus used.
And is that something that you all are...
It's a great question. I really don't know, I'm afraid.
Again, there's a very rough estimate that about 10 megatons are being washed every year to the oceans, to the sea. So people are eating 3 megatons, 10 to 12 megatons are being washed to the sea, and 36 megatons are being mined. So really, losses everywhere. It's not a real efficient system.
I think I've got another question or comment here. And if you could say your names, that would be helpful.
My name is Astrid Kahn Rasmussen. So this is a very fascinating conversation, but it seems like we have a gold mine here that you said nobody cares about. But it's a gold mine, obviously. So there seems to be old-fashioned business opportunity here. I mean, what are I'm very much into mission-related investment, impact investing, all this. And I was going to ask you, who else is doing this? There seems to be some untapped opportunities here.
So Darko finished on his slide saying about green taxes, which are required to resolve some of the challenges. Actually, for phosphorus, I mean, obviously, any subsidies or taxes would be helpful, but I actually think market economics will help us resolve this problem. Because from a water utilities perspective, when we first looked at this project, we sat around the board table and we ummed and ahed about it and went, well, we don't understand fertilizers. And that was where we shied away. We went, we are not touching the price of this. As we're now 2 years on, I'm looking at it thinking, bloody hell, why did I let that slip away? I can make money from this. And as the price of phosphorus goes up, I suspect you're going to see more of the water utilities just realizing that they've got a resource which is enormously valuable and wanting to capture it. But that's and we've got to go through a bit of a cycle for that.
One of my roles as moderator, I was asked to push people on information about pricing. Can you say anything more about the pricing?
I can't. I knew that question was going to come up, and so I've actually got a figure.
And I know I've got two folks who want to get in the queue.
So if I hold that up, that blue graph, which I appreciate isn't very helpful, is the price of phosphorus and how it's changed from 1995 to 2013. So you can see in recent years it's gone up. That little blip is to do with something that happened in the market that took it up to, it went from £22 a tonne to about 120, 103 now. So you can see it's got a trend of going up. We're selling it at probably less than £20 a tonne to Ostara at the moment.
Follow-up question. In terms of
Yeah, so this is the first Ostara facility in Europe. There are 5 of them in North America. It's a technology that spun out of Vancouver University about 5 or 6 years ago. Really innovative startup company. It's a terrific technology. It would be wrong to conclude that they're the only people that can do this. There are other types of technology. And we, in Thames, as you hopefully picked up, we will let anybody come along, see what we've done. We're not being secretive. You know, we think that this is a technology that anyone who wants to learn from our mistakes is more than welcome to come along. You know, there's things we'd do differently if we were doing it again, obviously.
Okay, I have about 5 people in the queue. I'm going to do my best to keep the order straight, but you're going to have to help me given that we don't have name tents and cards here. So I've got Randy next. I do know through our agree work that there's, I think, Piers, this is right, that there's some discussions in Iowa about doing a plant that's similar. Yeah. Okay. And again, if you could introduce yourselves.
Randy Hayes from Foundation Earth. I'm interested in the taxonomy of ecological externalities in terms of the life support systems of the biosphere. And so I'm familiar with the basics of the TEEB planetary boundaries. I was a little bit confused. You called these the 5 top problems, so to speak. But aren't the top problems more like these 8 boundaries? And how, if you could just clarify that, it would help. Because I'm also interested in whether any countries are requiring disclosure of the worst ecological externalities. Which ones do we need to solve first?
So,
this is seeking to address, I think. So the reason why this is an expansion of the original teamwork is that this was an applied study for business specifically, but it has also attracted the attention of policymakers. The planetary boundaries are the problem. That is actually actually it's a symptom. That's what's going to happen and is happening all the time. But the quantification of that in financial terms and related to the actors that are creating the problem is what this is. So this is highlighting the fact that, you know, probably fairly obviously, but there are some issues created by businesses and economies in general that whilst they might create some gain for one particular organization or actor in the economy, create a loss net overall for the economy. And so what if, for example, you were able to measure the net present value, for example, of a particular business or initiative, but compare that with the net present value of the benefit to society relating to those planetary boundaries, if you like. So that is what this is designed to highlight, is to show that actually you can use economic tools to understand that problem more carefully and apply it in the context of businesses. I hope that helps.
okay, thanks.
Sure. Griffin Carpenter, New Economics Foundation. And I want to ask about externalities versus scarcity. Because I think a lot of us are on the same page that externalities need to be priced, carbon, nitrogen, these things. But scarcity issues, shouldn't this be handled already in economics? I'm not saying practitioners are doing this successfully, but things like the phosphorus price. Okay, there's a scarcity issue, price is rising, our system should be accounting for that. So actually maybe, Richard, if you could respond to this on water. So you mentioned water scarcity issues not being related to price. If we're going to value water, should the scarcity be built into that or just the externality part?
Sure, thanks, Griffin. I think, you know, most people would say that scarcity should be priced into markets already. With respect to commodities, you could argue that, like gold, for example, you know, you could say that the less supply to the market and the more demand there is, the price will go up. But the issue is markets aren't perfect. They're not that efficient, actually, especially when it comes to globalized commodity production. So as we've offshored, outsourced, and fragmented our value chains to settle the price at the lowest point, factors such as externalities and scarcity don't get factored into the market so efficiently, because really, if you're a retailer in the UK, you really just care about the price and the fact that the quality of the good is being delivered to you on time. And that's it. So historically, you wouldn't have cared about the fact that children might have made that product, the local river was polluted, and there is no water left for the local community. Because the only signal coming through your supply chain is price and quality. And the fact that it's arrived in your shelf is a benefit in time. So I think that's part of the issue, is scarcity hasn't been priced and other externalities haven't been priced through market signals very efficiently, because through the course of outsourcing, offshoring, we've created, in fact, more problems in different parts in the world. In terms of water, I think scarcity is priced into the market at the point when there's a massive problem in water. So we know the worth of the water when there's none left. And so I'll give you another example of that. In China clear-felled over 50 years, it clear-felled 19 provinces worth of timber. Huge amount of timber. It supplied the global construction industry. And the price that it sold that timber at benefited the Chinese economy vastly. The problem is, in 1998, the Yellow River dried up, manufacturing shut down. It cost the Chinese government 30 billion overall in terms of the cost to the economy. So at that point, the externality and the scarcity, if you like, was priced. But up until that point, it hadn't been. So you're really talking about non-linear pricing of scarcity. It's not that it's not scarce, it's just that it's non-linear. And that's fed into the volatility of commodity prices.
Okay, back here in the back.
Thanks. Nick Silver, Callan Consulting and Institute of Actuaries. I've got really rather provocation rather than a specific question. And my sort of thinking of just listening to the talks here and the subject, I feel that measuring externalities is a necessity but not sufficient, because it's based on it works based on two premises. One, that there is a market, right? And if I look at the little I know about agriculture, it's not a free market, it's massively subsidized by government. So the things that change are the political economy drives change, and that doesn't really care about prices. It's how decisions are made in the political economy and lobbying and things like that. That's the first part. The second thing is externalities work very well if you need marginal change, but when you have to change paradigms, they don't work. And so I think the Haber process was invented at the beginning of the 20th century. The population has tripled. We've got more foods, and that's really this is because of the Haber process that we can fix nitrogen. So the whole agricultural system is based on the nitrogen cycle, and that we get nitrogen from fossil fuels, right? And so the whole system is set up to get it to another system where it's not based on nitrogen. You have to get a paradigm change, and so changing the marginal price doesn't work. You need actually to work out how you restructure the system, right? So my two things are political economy and how you get paradigm change of systems. And I don't think pricing externality actually is enough to do that.
Well, I think this builds on maybe one of your first points. As I was listening to the four presentations, you heard examples of how this could be done in terms of pricing externalities using existing data. I think it was Scott who also cautioned us that location matters a lot, that the costs change, and I think several of the presenters actually talked about the importance of public awareness and education and linking, I also think, the willingness to pay to benefits that people perceive for what they're receiving. So I think that the kind of dynamic nature of this is critically important. Did you want to add something, Scott? And then I'll go to Jane.
What I wanted to add was, so how do paradigm shifts occur? You gave us the example of the Haber-Bosch process, and what that did was it radically reduced the cost of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. So that acted, in effect, through incentives. It changed the cost structure of a key input in agricultural production. And the idea of measuring externalities and then finding ways to price externalities is essentially the same. It's building these into the incentive structure where they're not currently present. So I think the way that the way that paradigm shifts occur is through changes in incentives for behavior, and that to me is where measuring externalities and then finding ways to price them matters.
Okay, Jane? Do I have a microphone floating around somewhere?
Yeah, so my name's Jane Malin-Cady from the McKnight Foundation in Minnesota. And there may be another business opportunity for phosphorus in the Midwest with our very polluted lakes. I actually don't know if someone's trying to capture phosphorus out of the lakes. You might know that, but it's a huge issue there. So I'll float that one. But my question goes back to the first presenter. And there was the slide that you presented on the costs, the monetization of emissions, that you showed how the income and then the cost in the UK. And my question was, if you looked at that with different agricultural approaches, have you done some subsector analysis of those costs and benefits for a more ecological approach to agriculture, for example?
Was this the slide, Jane?
Can we get it on the large screen?
Is this it?
Well, then there was a graph that came next that
Can we just briefly start with the table? Okay. With the first one, that one, yeah. Yeah, well, thank you for the question. It's absolutely very relevant question. Well, let me take this opportunity also to briefly reflect also to the previous question. So I'll try to make a combined answer. So several times we have mentioned that, well, there is no market, it's not perfect, or that the conventional market does not recognize externalities, and that the price depends on a location, a magnitude of pollution, etc., etc. All that is true. Now, what is quite interesting with these figures is that actually these figures are based primarily on the health impacts. So, coming back also to your question, well, yes, it is true. Market is imperfect, but externalities do exist and they do have an economic value, regardless whether we like it or not. So, what happens here? This is a value, so to speak, of the human health in different countries, different European countries. And it does differ from one country to another country because it depends on the intensity of pollution, density of population, etc., etc. Now, coming back to your question regarding different agricultural subsectors. Well, I haven't done it yet for the graph that I've shown, but it would be very interesting. But we did it previously. Can we have the graph, please? It's down there. The next one, I think. Yeah, right. So what is quite interesting and what could be a powerful message is the following. Okay, here is a gross value added. So it is the basic economic term, so to speak. So this is why we have agriculture from the economic point of view, to generate some money. And this is what it generates. Now, at the other hand, at the same time, we have costs that are not accounted. And these costs primarily reflect human health. So it is the mortality and morbidity, the shortened lifespan, lower ability to work, to produce, etc., because of the air we breathe, because of the water we drink. So this does exist, regardless whether we want to recognize it or not. So it's quite interesting. And of course, different farming methods would create different externalities. We did some studies for large-scale conversion, the impact of large-scale conversion to organic farming. And seems to be favorable. So it does create less externalities. It does pollute a bit less, but still there are externalities, even in that case.
Jane, anything follow up to that?
Oh, I just wanted to say the patterns I see are a sense of urgency and actually some evidence that we have about this urgency.
Mm-hmm. Guillermo, thanks.
This is for maybe all the presenters. I still struggle with the notion about externalities that is hard to reconcile with where we're trying to actually do, not just learn about the world, but actually do something about it. And that is that externalities have two characteristics that makes them hard to be actionable. One is that, first of all, you have positive externalities and negative externalities, not just negative. And second, you have social, environmental, and all kinds of externalities. And then the question at some point is that, to me, it seems that there is some kind of a judgment call as to how you put together the equation about positive and negative externalities, and that ultimately this has to go through the political process or some kind of a governance process where those parties interested need to sit down and say, these are the positive, these are the negative, these are the externalities that we care about, these are externalities that we don't care about, and these are the ones that we're going to be focusing on. So there's nothing in my mind that is automatically the most important externalities that one should look at. So my question is more about how do we think about the political process by which we define which externalities to focus on, and what is the process by getting the right balance, because we're going to have positive and negative.
Panelists, anyone want to jump in?
I'm out of my depth with this audience, so I'm going to go first because I'll probably say the most stupid thing. For me, surely we've just got to stop the population going up. If we don't go for 9 billion people, but we actually go down to 5 billion people, then a lot of these problems disappear, don't they? Or am I being incredibly naive in that surely this is about education and birth control and helping people understand how they can, not have so many humans running around the planet that we can't cope with it.
Other panelists, comments, Richard?
Yeah, I think the very thorny issues to tackle. I think from a policy framework perspective, I'd just like to give you a little case study from China. It's a centrally governed economy, so they have an advantage because they're not a democracy, and they have a longer time frame, therefore, by which they can make decisions over, and they can change policies quickly, actually. But what they did was it started with an understanding of what these externalities actually are if you quantify them in financial terms. So I think the positive ones, people know. They know about growth, they know about the rise in the minimum wage, if you like, in China, the rise of the middle class in China. Those are all positive externalities. And some of those actually aren't externalities. You can measure them in GDP terms. The challenge is the negative externalities that come as a consequence of that growth. China has not decoupled its economic growth and its positive externalities from its negative externalities at all. And in fact, the kind of light bulb moment for the policymakers in China was when they did realize that 10% of GDP is lost every year as a consequence of air pollution, and that people die 5 years younger in northern China than they do in southern China. So actually that has an economic consequence, and you can quantify it today. So then, if you want your economy to remain competitive, there's essentially a self-interest in fixing that problem. This isn't something that we all need to get around and agree is a nice thing to do, so let's do it. There's a self-interest that the Chinese government has in fixing that problem. And the truth is, air pollution is something that China is seriously addressing today through the launch of 7 pilot carbon trading schemes. So whilst they're carbon trading schemes, the purpose of those schemes is to reduce air pollution and provide more energy resilience. The carbon piece appeals to the international community. So from a policy framework, they've acted in their own self-interest through understanding the quantum of externalities, both positive and negative, and they're acting on that. And for example, as well, they've regulated the banking sector to restrict capital flows. It's called the green credit policy in China, to 6 key polluting sectors that are damaging the economy at large. So ICBC, the world's largest and most profitable bank in China, has actually, it's got a cap that's lowering every year to those 6 sectors in terms of lending. So the cost of capital is going up for the businesses that are creating pollution. Regulation is coming in that is affecting how much you can emit in terms of air pollution and carbon. And there will be more regulation for the most polluting areas around Beijing and the steel mills and the iron ore production, because they affect things like water, contamination, health, all those kind of things. So I would kind of suggest that yes, we do need to see enlightened policy making, But the truth is, with more information provided to markets and to policymakers, I think you would see self-interested policymaking. The lack is, I think there's just a lack of that information being supplied to the right people, personally.
Good, thank you.
Okay. We ask the other panelists to jump in.
Yeah.
Two other folks, and I'll take our coffee break.
So this clearly is a complicated political economy issue. One area that I think deserves more attention than it's had, and here I'm bringing in points that have been made by my colleague Kathy Kling at Iowa State University, is particularly in North America and Canada, United States, and in UK, there is a tradition of, I think through English common law, of giving landowners broad property rights to do what they would like to do with their land. And this is particularly true of farmers, unless it directly and measurably impinges on the welfare of neighbors. And so out of this comes this sense that we need to subsidize farmers and provide positive incentives for changes of behavior. But agricultural pollution gets treated very differently from industrial pollution. We don't have the same kind of polluter pays notion in agriculture that we have in industry. And it may be that in a world of 8 or 9 billion people, we can't, this is not a model that is sustainable. Now, how one goes about altering those property rights is a politically very complicated process, but it may be something that deserves attention. And what that would mean, getting back to this location idea, is that there are certain externalities where location doesn't matter that much, in the sense of greenhouse gas emissions from nitrogen applications will occur almost no matter where a crop is grown or where livestock are raised, especially intensively. But some other things, particularly phosphorus issues, are very sensitive to the erodibility of soils in particular locations. And so there are vulnerability issues. That's true of water as well. And some of those, maybe these one could imagine a world in which land prices and the entitlements to do certain activities were based on the vulnerability of the environment in the local area. But that would mean a world in which the property rights associated with managing the land were attenuated in ways that are tied to environmental externalities from that production.
Well, yeah, just very briefly, I would like to reinforce what the previous speakers have already mentioned, and also highlight indeed that when we talk about agriculture, it's quite a different story than when we talk about energy sector or transport or particular industry, because the pollution is invisible, so to speak. It does not smell. There's no real urgency to solve it. There's no policy maker who will give a priority to reduce agricultural pollution over a plant that is a chimney without a filter, or a waste collection site that is smelling, looks ugly, etc., etc. So there is a hidden dimension of a hidden dimension when it comes to agriculture. Therefore, it is even more important to start talking, particularly with policymakers, and making them to be aware that those externalities do exist. Because, again, regardless whether we recognize them or not, they do exist. We pay them at the supermarket cashier, we pay them as taxpayers, and we pay them also as hospital patients.
Okay, thanks. All right, we've got about 5 minutes left. I've got 3 people who want to try to get him back here. First.
Anya Morris, I'm Head of Communications at the Sustainable Food Trust, so welcome to everybody. It's lovely to have you. I just wanted to make a comment, but actually it ties in very nicely with what Darko's just said. In the process of the last 3-4 months in the run-up to this event, starting to communicate publicly around the topic of true cost accounting and engaging the public in why we need to talk about the cost and value associated with our food has been personally an incredibly interesting experience, because there seems to me to be a huge interest and demand from the general public to have this dialogue and to have this conversation. And one of the things that really stuck with me from the Kentucky film that we showed is the what gets measured gets made sentence. No, there is something about going on the journey of mapping the costs and benefits, externalities and positive outcomes of different systems that will make visible to the general public an awful lot of information about the impacts of our current systems, which the majority of people do not currently relate to. And I think the big question for us, and the question I'm very interested in as we move into the communications section of tomorrow, is what is it that we can do to engage the general public when, for the majority of people, they not only don't have any idea of the impacts or costs associated with the purchases they make in the supermarkets, but they're actually kind of uninterested if the implication is that the cost of food will rise. So what are the powerful stories that we can tell about the kind of food systems or communities that we want to have in the future, which will allow us to take the scientific data of the cost and externalities and translate it into something that the public can buy into?
Okay, thanks. Right here?
Thank you. Christopher Bielenberg used to be chairman of the Organic Research Centre here in the UK for a number of years. I thought the whole series of presentations were absolutely fascinating, and I didn't realise the degree to which the work that you're all doing is helpful. But if I could just take this down to sort of a farmer level, I've also been a businessman, and one of the things that I think is absolutely striking about the farming industry at the moment is we've experienced it over the last 3 years, really, has been this astonishing hike in 2012 in prices, which made all farmers feel temporarily rather good, followed by a real slump going back from 260 to whether it was 130 or $170 euros a ton for wheat. With no particular corresponding cycle in the input cost, particularly of NPK. And therefore, it seems to me, quite apart from the risks that somebody sensibly addressed at the macro level, what we seem to have is an extraordinary exposure to our farming community and therefore to our entire supply chain in the fundamental risks of producing stuff in the ground when actually they are absolutely not in control of some of the externalities which are climatically determined from elsewhere, whether Russia goes down or the United States goes down. And one thing tends to be rather sure that because the input producers aren't stupid, as soon as farmers make a bit of money, the input prices will go up for sure, and therefore the farmer is continually going to be in the position of the tomato ketchup in the sandwich, which gets squeezed and has to come out sideways. And that seems to be maybe we need to get down at some stage in this conference from these fascinating observations that have been made down to actually what is this doing to the fundamental food supply chain at farmer level. We know that farmers are not happy, notwithstanding the fact that subsidies are being produced. But they are feeling very vulnerable and very exposed, and quite rightly so, because their farm gate prices are oscillating all over the place, and there's extreme volatility, and they have extreme volatility in their input costs, which would tendentially go upwards, but it's not clear. So I think maybe some of this very complex determination of the various externalities can enlighten farmers in thinking about what sort of farming systems they need in order to guard against the risks associated with what we're doing at the moment.
Okay, thanks. I know there are a few people in the queue, but we've got time for one more comment question, and then we'll take a coffee break, and we will come back so we can continue in the next session.
Yeah, Lawrence Caldrick from West Country Rivers Trust. We work with a lot of farmers in the west of England, and I think that comment before is absolutely spot on. Farmers are unlike any other business in terms of the amount and quantity and quality of ecosystem services we get or don't get. from their land, and I think there's a lot of things we expect for free from them. And so there's this addressing, and all businesses are set up to make money, and they tend to do that by ignoring some of the externalities. If they had to account for everything, actually most of them wouldn't be working. Some of the examples from China you were picking out of where they've sold forestry, the sort of going back, they'd probably sit there and say, no, it doesn't stack up, we won't do it. But there's one of the things I just want to pull apart is what we found is that the services farmers can supply and the way we consume them is very, very spatially variable. And so there's an interesting dynamic on where a service is either provided or not provided and where it's consumed. And what we found is one of the ways of finding, being able to pull this apart and describe this to people, I'll be speaking in the next session about it, is about mapping that supply and mapping that demand and understanding the spatial variability of that within a landscape. And actually, it was more of a point, but one question that comes out of it, actually, which is directed to peers, is about things like within the siting of the Slough work. Was there much work in the way of the mapping of where to site that in terms of how much phosphate was coming down? Yeah, okay. I'll pick it out afterwards.
Because you love Slough so